The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
Good evening. Happy New Year to you and welcome to 1984. The year we have just started promises to be a very significant one indeed in Idaho. It is, for starters, an election year. That will be interesting. In just over a week, the Idaho legislature will convene to discuss, among other things, taxation and education. 1984 will be, without a doubt, a year of important events and personalities in this state. But tonight, before we plunge headlong into 1984, we do what we do every year at this time, take a look back at the year just past. We'll spend the next half hour reviewing the major stories as we've covered them on this broadcast during the last 12 months. So if you will, for a moment, put aside any thoughts of 1984 and reflect with us for a bit on 1983.
Well, from what you can see, it's bad. Just about every building in town has sustained quite a bit of damage. It's going to be real hard to put a dollar amount on it. It's extensively a lot of damage structurally to every building here.
By most measure, the biggest single news story in Idaho in 1983 was a story that came in jolts and aftershocks. The earthquake in central Idaho that caused millions of dollars in damage and took the lives of 2 small children in Challis.
We're alarmed at the extent of the earthquake and some of the damage. Of course, the loss of those 2 children was heartbreaking.
Were you scared?
Huh? Scared? I didn't know what was happening, so much noise.
By year's end, earthquake research in Idaho was intensifying and building codes were being re-examined. The quake also served to reopen old questions about the safety of the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory, which is located on the edge of the quake zone. The questions have new importance now because of Energy Secretary Donald Hodell's recommendation in 1983 that INEL be the home of a new production reactor, a multi-billion-dollar project that would manufacture material for nuclear weapons.
The Secretary's decision shifts the odds in favor of Idaho. I think that somebody else has to show a reason now why it should not be put here. That means that the odds are pretty good, but it doesn't mean that it's absolutely certain. This decision just starts the process.
The public support for locating the proposed reactor in eastern Idaho was great, but in other areas of the state, some folks were worried.
You know, Idaho is dependent upon their limited water supply. We're an agricultural state, we're a tourist state, and any threat to our water, whether real or even you know, an implied threat, any kind of a risk or a harm to the reputation of our clean water could really cause a problem here.
Well, let me open this up and go back to Mr. Wade in Pocatello. About these environmental concerns, sir, does Dr. Rassel have legitimate concerns?
Well, I think certainly Dr. Rassel has legitimate concerns about any project of this magnitude, whether it's a nuclear reactor or not. You need to look very carefully at the effect on all parts of the environment. I believe we feel that this reactor can be constructed and operated in Idaho with essentially minimal impact.
In southwestern Idaho's Owyhee County, the hazardous waste byproducts of other parts of our society got great attention in 1983. At issue, the safety of a waste disposal site. At year's end, the safety question's still unresolved for many people.
What the people of Idaho have to keep in mind that Owyhee County is a long way from where they live, and it's a small community down there. But these same trucks transverse large cities throughout the state coming in from other states before they ever get to Mountain Home, Grandview, and Bruno. So one of these trucks could just as well turn over in Idaho Falls or Caldwell. And the way our system exists in the state of Idaho now, who would respond? Who would take the responsibility if one of those trucks were to catch on fire at a motel or at a cafe or at a truck stop?
There is no information that I have right now that would suggest that there are health hazards affecting people at this time.
In Bonner County during 1983, a hazard of another kind, asbestos in a public school.
I was outraged because I thought that it was so obvious to me that these pipes
needed repair, and it was a possibility that they could be asbestos. And then I found out that the EPA guidelines had told schools in 1979 to make parents aware of where this problem occurred, and that actually made me more angry than just about anything.
In a number of significant ways, the Idaho Supreme Court figured in big news during 1983. The court's 1982 decision about water rights on the Snake River at Swan Falls Dam kept Idaho legislators, the governor, and Idaho Power Company busy during all of 1983.
But there is a limit to the water, there is a limit to the cheap energy that we have, and there is a limit to how much land is out there that's arrogable and tillable. I think we're approaching that limit, at least in the area of cheap energy. The high cost of energy in Idaho, if you think it's high, and we do have much higher than it used to be, but it's still a lot cheaper than it is in most places, it comes from those coal plants that we built primarily to provide the energy to institute public policy in the 1960s and 1970s to pump water out of the main stem of the Snake River and irrigate some ground that I consider to be probably pretty shaky in today's economy.
At year's end, the Swan Falls issue remains in large part unresolved and will likely be an issue well into 1984. The political process of carving up Idaho's legislative districts became a judicial job in 1983. A district court judge in northern Idaho drafted his own reapportionment plan. It's under review now by the state Supreme Court.
Reapportionment is a very complicated thing, but basically it determines the formation of the legislative districts in the state from which the candidates are elected, and that can determine the balance of power in the legislature. It can determine which party controls the legislature. It can determine what kind of legislator is elected, whether he's from the rural areas or the urban areas. So it's very important in terms of the kind of laws passed by the legislature.
It has a great deal to do with the makeup, the kind of people who are going to serve in the legislature,
right,
and where they serve from. Randy Staples in Pocatello, you've been following this since, really since what, about 1981, I guess, when the legislature first started this process. Why is it so hard to do?
Well, everybody has their own interests in it. Some of the attorneys in favor of throwing out the legislature's plan point out that legislators were following their own self-interests in enacting the plan they did. And of course, that's true, but everybody has their own particular interests. In fact, Judge Cogswell acknowledged in his discussion of how he arrived at his plan, acknowledged that he was adhering to certain interests in creating that particular plan.
The Supreme Court also made a controversial December 1983 ruling overturning a longtime Public Utilities Commission policy of not allowing utilities to figure construction work in progress into rates. The Commission reacted sharply, and so did ratepayers who vowed to overturn the court ruling by passing an anti-QIP law.
I don't believe that you want to remove discretion and judgment from the Commission. And that's what you do when you pass a statute. Now, Connolly's saying that the Supreme Court removed all his discretion and judgment, and I'm saying, no, they didn't.
Okay.
That's really where I end up.
Mr. Ward, how about an anti-QIP law in Idaho?
Well, I don't know. We'll wait and see when that comes up. I'm sure we'll give serious thought to some legislative remedy, but we haven't thought exactly what that might be.
1983 was the year of default for two Washington Public Power Supply System nuclear projects. Whoops became a household term last year in Idaho, and for many, it was synonymous with a billion-dollar failure. The state Supreme Court did say in September that Idaho municipal utilities didn't need to pay off their Whoops obligations. During '83, former Idahoan Peter Johnson continued to pilot the Bonneville Power Administration through the wreckage of the Whoops debacle. He tried, and at year's end hadn't succeeded, in finding a solution that would satisfy bondholders, the courts, the Congress, and of course, the ratepayers. Meanwhile, there was new talk of abandoning yet another Whoops plant.
And we also conclude that if project number 3 is dropped for any reason, if it's terminated, that will be a high-cost alternative.
The state legislature convened a year ago facing a huge budget deficit. After wrangling for weeks over tax increases and funding for education, lawmakers finally increased the state sales tax by 1.5 cents. But Governor John Evans was never satisfied with the money spent on education.
You know, just a 215 appropriation just is not an amount necessary that we need.
Reporters tried to pin the governor down on what figure he would accept. $225 million was suggested.
Well, that's a little bit low, and I hate to negotiate here with the press. I really don't think you've got much influence up there.
Evans finally called a special session after a record 94-day regular session to try and force more education spending. It didn't work. The legislature did pass a major rewrite of the drunk driving law in 1983.
It's the first thing that we do on a first offender, someone who is driven in some unlawful way and had his license removed by the state. If he is caught driving again, we give him a 2-day mandatory minimum right out of the starting block. And that can be extended up to 6 months by the court.
And what this bill says is if you cause great bodily harm, permanent disability, or permanent disfigurement, and you're guilty of driving while under the influence, you have committed a felony in this state. And this is even on a first offense, it is felonious. And this is the section of the law that I believe the people in this state really desire. They don't want people getting in their cars and mixing booze and hurting people.
In northern Idaho in 1983, there was talk of political secession, with northern Idaho, eastern Washington, and western Montana forming into a new 51st state. That state hasn't happened yet, but the movement did send a message. Well, can a movement like this send a message to politicians, for example?
I think it can send some kind of a message, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a new one. I don't think that the idea that northern Idaho is disgruntled with Boise, or for that matter that eastern Idaho is disgruntled with Boise, is necessarily a new message. I think Boiseans have been aware of that for a long time.
Idaho politics in 1983 were anything but dull. George Hansen, the 2nd District Congressman, was indicted for filing incomplete financial disclosure forms. Hansen, a Republican, vigorously defended his innocence, and at year's end, the case was still in the courts. Why would the Justice Department and a Republican administration want to get a Republican congressman who's been such a strong supporter of a Republican president?
Well, that's probably an interesting question, but it's a very simple answer. I can tell you a few years ago, I went to the Secretary of the Treasury, who was at that time William Simon, and I asked him to help me with a case for a person who had difficulty with the Internal Revenue Service. And I said, why don't you just call over there? He said, don't ask me to call over there. He said, they complain about political influence when you do. And so this is the problem. You say it's a Republican administration, but the people down in the bowels of the Justice Department aren't necessarily Republican. And if anyone from on top interferes with them, then all at once you have those leakages come out in the media that you're having some kind of political influence or political pressure. So it's probably just the contrary, that the administration is somewhat handicapped in even looking after its own under those circumstances.
Hansen's 1982 Democratic opponent, Richard Stallings, announced he'll be running again in '84. So did Republican Dan Adamson. And Senator James McClure made plans in 1983 to seek re-election this year and to also seek the job of Senate Majority Leader. Congressman Larry Craig, the Republican in the 1st District, broke publicly with the Reagan administration over its policy in Lebanon. No one yet is talking of challenging him as he seeks re-election. Former Governor and Interior Secretary Cecil Andrus made sounds in '83 like he'd like to run for governor again. And he appeared on this broadcast in October to analyze with Senator Steve Sims the resignation of his controversial successor at the Interior Department, James Watt.
I can't judge Jim Watt. It wouldn't be fair. And Jim Watt has no business trying to judge me.
Well, what,
let history judge
well, let me ask the question in slightly
I'll judge them both. I think that Cecil Andrus was a good administrator, even though I disagreed with some of the policies of Interior. And I think Jim Watt was one of Reagan's best administrators in his cabinet of going in and making changes, not changes in, you know, how the paper supply went through the department or those things, but he made some concrete changes and policy changes with respect to moving forward with coal leasing and some of these things that got off dead center. And it wasn't just the Republican and Democrat administration that had bogged some of these things down, but there was a big election in 1980, and Jim Watt took advantage of that election to put some changes in. And Cease, you know, you got that Alaska Lands Bill through, which I disagreed with, but yet I'd have to say that it was something that you got through the Congress. And,
yeah, it's difficult, but the point is, and Steve almost touched on it there, is the fact that that wasn't Jim Watt's policies from the land management. That was Ronald Reagan's policies. They're not going to change. Whoever comes in there is going to take his cue from the president, who is running for re-election, in my opinion, although he hasn't announced yet. So I think you're going to see...
He's not running, you and I are poor judges.
That's right.
Politicians, right?
If he is getting ready for a good horse race, why, he's in the wrong business. But
so it is a matter of a change of style as opposed to
that's absolutely right. They have amputated a festering sore.
The Idaho wilderness issue moved front and center during 1983, a preview of what could be a major political issue in '84.
The main force behind the wilderness movement is being generated outside the state, and all of the polls would bear me out that the majority of Idahoans don't seem to favor that type of designation.
Palisades and Garnes Mountain are some of the most important wildlife habitat in eastern Idaho. They're also on the edge of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and they serve as a migration corridor where wildlife can come down from the general area of Yellowstone and Teton Park and migrate into other parts of Idaho and western Wyoming. They're also highly scenic, and they're readily accessible from Idaho Falls and Pocatello, and we feel this is an area that's also important from the standpoint of assuring water quality into the Snake River and the Palisades Reservoir.
And it seemed that timber industry and conservation groups couldn't have been farther apart.
Well, what the environmentalists have proposed would mean that fully 1/3 of Idaho's national forest would be managed as wilderness. That, of course, would preclude all motorized recreation, all logging, mining, all roaded access whatsoever. And that, I think that just totally flies in the face of public opinion. Certainly it's completely out of sync with the results of Senator McClure's survey.
Too much wilderness?
Oh, definitely.
Mr. Ford?
Well, I don't think so. No. Our proposal is a compromise. There's about 8 million acres of roadless land that's at stake here. Our proposal is to classify 2.9 million acres of that as wilderness and release for non-wilderness management 4.1 million acres. We simply think it makes sense for Idaho to keep the best parts of its wild land wild.
The improving economy was big news in '83. So were stories about banking deregulation, airline deregulation, and the breakup of the telephone company. But the ever-improving economy left some observers, like MIT economist Lester Thurow, worried about how economies like Idaho's would do in the long run.
And the problem over the next year or two is that nobody's really forecasting growth rates high enough to get back to the point where mining takes off and timber takes off and some of these natural resource industries really start to boom. And so there certainly is no boom on the horizon for the kinds of industries that are, those kind of industries in Idaho or Montana.
So they're going to lag persistently behind the rest of the economy.
That's right.
What about the agricultural economy?
Agriculture economy is in a very sick shape. And it's apt to be in much sicker shape politically this year because we may have an absolute disaster where the federal government programs for agriculture costs more money than the farmers get. So that in theory you could close down every farm, close down the Department of Agriculture and just give the money to farmers and they would be better off. And it's just clear the urban taxpayer is not going to sit still for that $40 billion farm subsidy program for very long.
Idaho's only reform school, the Youth Services Center in St. Anthony, was much in the news in 1983. The National Youth Law Center complained of unconstitutional practices at the school, and a committee of experts recommended major changes to ease, among other things, overcrowding.
And I think Representative Hooper's characterization of St. Anthony as a catch-all is certainly correct, and over the years that's what it's become, and the staff at St. Anthony and the department directors have a hard time fitting that phenomenally varied mix of students into a uniform rehabilitative program.
I think the important thing to consider is that for the short term, if there have been abuses, they are not taking place now. If there have been some disciplinary practices which were not right, those are not taking place now, in large part thanks to this committee and thanks to the people from San Francisco. If there had been overcrowding, which there is not the overcrowding now. In the short term, we do need some more staff. So a lot of good has been accomplished. Concrete changes have been accomplished.
Also in 1983, the legislature narrowly approved a new law requiring those who could afford to pay for part of their relative's nursing home or institutional care. Many folks who attended public hearings said that was unfair.
I feel that House Bill 28 is more or less a punishment to people that have already been punished.
We heard a lot of comments on that videotape in the hearing last night about how fairly this can be done, or if it can be done fairly. Can it be done fairly?
I think it can. I don't think we were fair to the Medicaid clients last year who had to lose eligibility for hospital care. They may not have anybody who can help them. They may not have insurance. They may not have a family. What we're trying to do is place some burden on that portion of our Medicaid population that can accept that burden.
The newborn intensive care unit at Boise St. Luke's Hospital was home for a while to an abandoned, brain-damaged infant during 1983. Baby Ashley, she was named. Her care prompted debate over whether extraordinary measures should be taken to keep her alive.
Is there a point beyond which, if we keep this child alive, or any other child, and I don't want to talk about this one particularly, are we doing a disservice to that child and to the people who surround it?
Baby Ashley would die, but the debate she helped create will certainly continue. The State Board of Education decided during 1983 that students should spend more time in the classroom, at least 90% of the time. Critics said it would cut deeply into important extracurricular activities, but State School Superintendent Jerry Evans defends the idea.
A number of people are saying this will mean the end of the activity program. That is certainly not the intent of the State Board of Education. We recognize the need for an activity program and certainly do not want it curtailed or limited in such a way that there's no opportunity. But if you take each one of these activities by itself, whether it's student government, music, athletics, vocational agriculture, no matter what it is, if you analyze it alone and by itself, it's a good experience for a young person. But how many of those can you add up in the course of an advanced math class or a chemistry class or a physics class where those students are taken out of that class without having a very adverse effect on chemistry, physics, or math?
This extremely controversial anti-Mormon film, The Godmakers, caused quite a debate too during '83, as it was widely shown in fundamentalist churches in Idaho. We broadcast excerpts of the film that greatly upset some, and interviewed a church spokesman about attacks on the Mormon faith.
It is the latest chapter. I hope it is not the kind of thing that went on sometime in history. I don't think it is, but certainly one of the reasons for our being willing to appear and make a statement this evening has to do with the fact that there are some people who legitimately wonder what our beliefs are as to this film.
Or maybe we should say that you weren't all that anxious to appear here.
That's correct. I think it's a fair statement that we are have no desire to debate.
I want to confirm, is this an exercise? Negative. Roger, copy. This is not an exercise. Stand by to copy the message. Standing by.
The controversial film of the year was broadcast by ABC. It was called The Day After. It was about a nuclear attack on Kansas City.
The production techniques and the writing and acting are no better or worse than a lot of other television fare. It's the subject. It is the subject, and it does reach out and grab you.
And in a word, it's treated fairly.
I believe it is. I believe it is.
While millions were watching The Day After, U.S. Pershing and cruise missiles were going into Europe, and a conference on Russian awareness was being attacked by Senator Steve Sims in Boise. We talked with some of the participants in that controversial conference.
I can understand why there would be very large street demonstrations in these European capitals. But I think in one respect they're unfortunate, and that is that they would indicate a perspective that it is the United States that is the problem, and it is the United States missiles that are the problem, as opposed to the Soviet Union and Soviet missiles that are the problem.
This man, Dean Hinton, was sacked as the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador in 1983. But during an interview here in September, despite a lot of talk that he was not a hard enough hardliner, Hinton defended the administration's policy directed toward Nicaragua. The president has said a number of times that we're not going to protect that government from its own people. That's our policy, obviously. Why does that policy not work in El Salvador, too, where the people are in revolt against their government?
Well, I don't think the people are in revolt in El Salvador. I think a very small minority are in revolt. You have in Salvador a government that was democratically elected by the overwhelming majority of the people.
Aren't the two situations analogous, though? If you say a small minority in El Salvador, isn't there a small minority that is in revolt against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua?
Well, Mark, I'll grant you this. There are some parallels. And it seems to me that the answer is for the Sandinistas, the comandantes, to hold free elections with lots of international observers and let the Nicaraguan people decide whether that's what they really want, just as I think that's what ought to happen in El Salvador once again.
Ronald Reagan found himself defending his White House counselor, Edwin Meese, over some comments Meese made about hunger.
Policy and my own feeling in this administration is that if there is one person in this country hungry, that is one too many.
And in Boise, we found some hungry people at a soup kitchen.
If it wasn't for soup kitchens, like my husband and I wouldn't be able to eat. We'd be hungry. And it's very hard. And these people are very good.
The president's farm policy was under attack in 1983 by some Idaho farmers like Dalen Reese, particularly upset about a proposal to freeze price support levels. Well, just in a word, if we were to freeze these payments for 2 years, would it lower farm income?
Definitely.
No question about that.
No
Secretary Block says it needn't, but you obviously think it will. Mr. Meyer, will it lower farm income?
I don't think it's clear. Whether the prices will go up or down, I can't say. That depends on the world economy, I think, more. But I think the loan level, at least, needs to be lowered to take away that incentive for those other people to expand production and take away our markets.
The man who brought us one of the most unusual messages of the year was Timothy Leary, the 1960s drug guru. He's now a popular campus lecturer. You remember Timothy Leary, tune in, turn on, drop out. Well, he has a new message for the 80s, perhaps particularly a message for 1984.
My motto today, because of my conviction that the personal computer and video games as educational tools are going to take over, doing what drugs did for many people in the 60s, my motto today would be turn on, tune in, and hook up.
So there's our glance back over the shoulder at 1983. We'll be back here tomorrow night with other news permitting, an analysis of what proves to be a very big story in 1984, namely the changes in the telephone system in this country due to the breakup of AT&T. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.